Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi wa sahbihi sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah. Hope everybody's doing well. Rabbi shrah sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Alhamdulillah. So we'll continue on, inshallah, with this discussion on practical spirituality. And today we're going to be diving into this topic, which is focused on mindfulness of Allah and how to increase your mindfulness. The way that it's translated in the text is vigilance, and the Arabic word that they're referring to is called muraqaba. Muraqaba, which is a form of essentially actualizing the idea that God is always watching us, and that if He's always watching us, we should try our best to maintain a degree of humility, shyness, and just overall consciousness that He is aware of every single action that we do, and He is aware of all the thoughts that we have, and that in that He is also with us and assisting us, and that should also inspire in us a bit of carefulness in terms of how we approach our life, so that we try to stay away from sin. So the core hadith here that's really important is a hadith in which, known as Hadith Jibril, in which Sayyidina Jibril alayhi salam, it was mentioned actually that a man came to the Prophet ﷺ while he was with the Sahaba, a few of the Sahaba, and this man was wearing all white clothing, and he had no traces of travel on him. And he came and he sat next to the Prophet ﷺ, and he had his knees next to the knees of the Prophet ﷺ. And he asked him he started asking him questions. So he said, "Tell me about Islam." And then the Prophet ﷺ said that Islam is to pray 5 times a day, to fast, and then he listed the rest of the pillars of our religion. Then he said, "Tell me about Iman." And then he said, Iman is to believe in Allah, to believe in the messengers, to believe in the angels, the books. And he listed the core principles of faith, to believe in Allah on the last day, and so on and so forth. And then he asked him, "Tell me about ihsan. Tell me about excellence." Spiritual excellence is how it's translated many times. And the Prophet ﷺ responded, he said, "It is to worship Allah as though you see Him. But if you do not see Him, then know that He sees you." And that was his emphasis in terms of what ihsan is. And then he mentioned, "Tell me about the hour." And the Prophet ﷺ said that the one asking knows no more than the one being asked. And then he said, "Tell me about the signs." And then the Prophet ﷺ went on to list a few of the signs. And so those 3 that we usually emphasize, right? Islam, Iman, and Ihsan are core aspects of kind of building the Muslim. And then there's this 4th aspect, which many times we neglect, which we're not going to talk about today, but it's this idea of knowing the signs of the end of times, which is also a core part of being a Muslim that we should definitely invest time into, to making sure we know those. So the 3rd area, though, was this idea of ihsan, to worship Allah as though you see Him, and that if you don't see Him, know that God sees you. And that's what we'll be diving deeper into today, inshallah. And it's not like something with Islam, you can implement the outward actions and you will essentially be following the process of being a Muslim, right? And then you can believe in what you need to believe in, and you will follow the process of being a mu'min. But to be a muhsin, to be a person of excellence, it's by no means that straightforward, right? There requires a very inward awakening that God is always watching me and always with me. And that takes time to cultivate. And so Imam al-Haddad is going to, once again, as he does, he's going to give us the secrets for how to go about doing that very quickly. And so he mentions that you have to be mindful of God in all of your movements, in every stillness, in every moment, in every blink of the eye, with every thought, and in every state. So he tries to get us to realize the importance of knowing that, okay, God is watching me in not just what I say and what I do, not just when I'm alone or when I'm in public, but even my thoughts He's aware of. And He is closer to me than my jugular vein. He is closer to me than your consciousness itself. As you know, consciousness is linked to your jugular vein. If you lose that, you lose consciousness. And so he's trying to encourage us then to feel God's nearness to you, right? Actually feel it. Many times we go about our days and we just do the outward actions of worship, and we very much have a difficult time being present, right? Like for me, half of this past day was definitely like that. There's so many things going on at work that everything, prayers is going through the motions, but it was very difficult to be present. And so we actually have to work on our inward states such that even in the hustle and the bustle of life, with everything we have going on, when we go to those moments where we actually have to give time to our spiritual state, we have to give time to Allah, we are feeling that God is actually watching me and I am present with God. This is not in any physical way. We're talking here in terms of a spiritual presence. And so then he mentions that the way to go about doing this is to actually realize and contemplate this fact. He is actually with you wherever you are with his knowledge. He's aware of everything you're doing, right? And he's assisting you if he chooses. He's assisting you in every single moment. I mean, for every human being, if God was not assisting you, you wouldn't be able to breathe, you wouldn't be able to blink your eyes, you wouldn't be able to, your blood would not circulate, and so on and so forth. And so Allah is always assisting you. And then he said, though, if you are of the righteous, if you are from the Salihin, Allah will guide you, assist you, and protect you. So now this awareness becomes something more comprehensive because you are not just aware of Allah, but you are actually of the people who's aware and who's acting upon his or her knowledge. And now this assistance, this special assistance comes. So then he mentions this idea that now how do you again practically implement it? We're going to try to just take away like the most critical aspects of what he mentions, or the most practical aspects of what he mentions. So he says the first principle that he lays out and the first action that we can take is to instill a state inside of yourself that is a very, very modest and humble state. And what does that mean? It means that you should actually take yourself to account to make sure God never sees you where he's forbidden you, and that he never misses you where he's commanded you to be. Those are the two areas. If we can get those down in life, we'll have lived a successful life, inshallah. That, okay, did I go somewhere where he told me not to go? Did I do something that he told me not to do? That's the first level of this, right? So like many times we get into this rut with religion where it's like it's all rules and no fun, right? It's all rules, it's all rules, it's all rules. When you live the rules without any understanding of why the rules are there, yes, it can seem kind of boring and dry on the outside when it's all the rules, but the rules are to get you somewhere. The rules are to get you to this spiritual experience where you're actually having a tranquility, as we mentioned, descend. You're actually feeling less anxious, and you're really, really knowing that God is with me. He's going to take care of me, right? If I'm going through this problem with my family, or this problem at work, or this problem with my friends, or this problem with my spouse, so on and so forth, I know that I'm doing my absolute best. I may be falling short, but I'm trying to be conscious that God is going to help me. He will help you, inshallah. He says, I'm in the opinion of my servant, right? To be in the opinion of his servant, you have to have an opinion of him in the first place. If we're just heedless and we're never thinking about Allah and we're never trying to be aware about Allah, then how are we going to be in the opinion, or how are we going to have an opinion? So that's the first aspect here, is this idea of modesty and this idea of feeling a level of shyness. So when you miss something, man, God told me I should, at 6 a.m. in the morning, I'm supposed to be awake. I'm supposed to be praying. But today I slept through till 7 and Fajr time was gone. And now what am I supposed to do, right? When you have that feeling and you miss something, you actually say, oh, hold on, right? What happened there? Instead of every day sleeping through till 7 or 8 and just like not even caring. And then now that starts to become the problem. The Muslim is not asked to get everything right. The Muslim is asked to try. The muhsin, the one who's striving towards spiritual excellence, generally speaking, is asked to get everything as right as possible. That is the station to aspire to, right? To really be aware of God in every moment. You don't just want to be like doing the basics. So I'll give an example here just so we can make it very, very practical. That the idea of him never missing you where he has commanded you to be would be that at minimum, let's say it's Fajr time, and you, at some portion of the time, you are praying the Fajr prayer between comes in 5:40 right now, 5:45 or something like that right now, and up until about 6:50, 6:55 when the sun rises, we're in that window, we're praying. That's at the minimum, right? To just be where God told us to be. But to aspire towards excellence in this state would be that you are awake at the beginning of the time, that ideally as Fajr comes in, you are seeking Allah's forgiveness, And then ideally, especially if you are a male, you are present in the masjid praying Fajr in Jama'ah. That would be like the station to aspire to be. And if you're a woman, then just praying Fajr at home, but still in the earlier part of the time. That would be better than praying in the later part of the time, right? As kind of an example here. And so when it comes to being aware and gaining this awareness, the more you strive towards doing something with excellence and ihsan and quality and trying to kind of perfect it, right? Of course, with our weak human abilities, the more the mindfulness starts to increase, the more the mindfulness starts to increase. Doing everything at the bare minimum, it's very difficult to attain the state of mindfulness, right? Because something else clearly was a priority. Mindfulness of Allah becomes attained when God is your first priority. He's your priority. Nothing, okay. You have a meeting at work and the meeting is so long that you're going to miss Jummah. Got to talk to somebody at work. Say, I can't miss Jummah. This is for men, especially, again, in this instance, right? Can't miss Jummah. I have to go to Jummah. It's part of my religion. It's a fard. I'm gonna have the confidence to talk to my manager and let them know, hey, I have something I have to be at, right? Or I have to pray whatever prayer I have to pray at the time that I'm at work. That's preferring God over something else. Preferring the dunya would be, oh, well, my boss told me I got to do so, and so I'm not going to, can't say no. Well, there's a bigger boss than the boss who told you, and that's God, and we're not obeying him, right? So that is the level that we want to aspire to. It's okay if we're not there yet, but we just kind of continue to aspire to that. Then there's the idea of not being where he has forbidden you to be. Now, this starts to get kind of intricate, right? But I'll just give it at a couple of different levels. At the first level, it's like the big stuff that he told us not to do, right? So like, we shouldn't be at a bar drinking, inshallah, right? We shouldn't be like at the party, at the college party partying. We shouldn't be, if we know people who are like smoking, we shouldn't be with them smoking. Those are the kind of kaba'ir sins, right? But then there will be more and more nuances as you try to attain a deeper state of mindfulness. A show comes on, or let's say you're on social media, and now images start to pop up we shouldn't be seeing. Okay, does the person lower your gaze? Because if you're not lowering your gaze, it means you don't think God is watching you. Because how could you ever look at something haram if you knew God was watching you? It means the mindfulness isn't there yet, right? The minute you know God is watching me, say, astaghfirullah, what am I looking at? And you won't just scroll past it, you'll just delete that. The ideal state is delete that entirely, or you'll just exit from the app, whatever it is, right? Maybe there's a Netflix show or something someone is watching, and that show, we know it has quite a lot of problematic scenes in it. The ideal state of mindfulness is I don't even want anything to do with this, because every 10 minutes every 3 minutes I have to figure out, like, lower my gaze or try to ignore what they're saying, or so on and so forth, right? Or forward the scene, whatever it is. But if someone's not there yet, then okay, at the very least, we kind of try to make sure we don't see haram. And haram, by the way, viewing haram, anything that's haram to do is haram to look at. Sometimes we like only focus on adult scenes and sexual scenes when it comes to, it's not the only thing haram. Haram to look at mass killing. It's haram to look at people shooting each other. All of those things would be considered impermissible by many of the ulama because they're haram to do, and so they're going to hurt your eyes. It would be considered impermissible to listen to foul language, people always cursing at each other and so on and so forth. That wouldn't be something you would want to do. If you're not there yet, alhamdulillah, we just keep working towards it. But at least we know that if I want to be mindful of Allah, I need to know that he's watching me in this instance. And I need to know that I probably shouldn't be doing this thing. And at minimum, I should make istighfar. So that would be the part of not being where he told us not to be. And this gets into like deeper and deeper levels, right? Like you're at a wedding and there's just like really things you're not comfortable with going on at the wedding, but you're like, oh, it's not a big deal. All the people here are Muslims, so what's the big deal for me to engage? Well, God would probably not prefer for us to even be doing that, let alone to be engaging it. So you have to know, okay, and when this type of stuff happens, right? Example here, this happens all the time now in the Muslim community, that you have weddings where there's like open dancing going on and so on and so forth. That's categorically impermissible in our religion. If we engage in that, we would be considered to be in a state of sin. We have to at least be conscious that, okay, like I'm going to step out during the part when the dance floor opens up, right? Like I'm not just going to be in it. I'm going to try to, because otherwise if I'm in it, my nafs is going to slowly pull me towards it. I won't be able to lower my gaze, so on and so forth. If we're not ready yet though, okay, we just, we have to negotiate things with the way our lives are, our families' lives are, and what types of ways we might want to be trying to kind of keep ties, because people will do things in a different way. You don't have to be the guy who's like, this is haram, go shut everything off. That's not what we're saying. But you have to know for yourself, God is watching me, and I don't want to be in a place that's impermissible. And then are you doing the second part then, he asks, where God has commanded you to be. So the prayers are at the basic level. Okay, in Ramadan, he's commanded us to be fasting, to be awake at certain times. So that would be inculcating mindfulness. Every time you do a certain action, you realize that God is watching you, rather than just doing the action because your parents told you to do so, or because you just grew up thinking that was the thing to do. And not actually being present and aware that, hold on, like the Lord who created the stars and the planets and the heavens and the galaxies and the universe is actually watching me right now. And he's aware of what I'm doing. Try to take 5 seconds before you engage in something to bring that to heart, right? So that will now bring this kind of aspect of modesty deep down inside. And you actually feel a little bit shy before God before you do anything. And modesty applies just as much to men as it does to women. Sometimes it's only discussed in Islamic circles as a concept of women. Men are supposed to be humble, modest people who feel shy before God, right? From an outward aspect of clothing and so on and so forth, all the way to just the way that we engage, just as much, of course, as women are. Then he gets into now, how do you practically start to remind yourself? Now, this is like going to sound a little bit weird, but Imam al-Ghazali, in his section on this topic and his section on vigilance, he actually says you have to hold yourself to account. You have to talk to yourself. Like, you can't just assume that you're going to get it on your own. He mentions that the nafs is like an animal that has to be trained. The nafs here being your lower self and your ego. And you cannot assume that an animal is just going to be trained on its own. And so we have narrations, for example, that there would be times that somebody would come outside the home of Sayyidina Omar, and they would hear Sayyidina Omar admonishing somebody. How could you do this? How could you do this? And then they would seek permission to enter. And then Sayyidina Omar would let them in, and there was nobody there except for him. And he was just talking to himself, admonishing his own self. And this is Sayyidina Omar. What would he even need to admonish himself on? He was such an amazing person, mashallah. But this is the level that these people get to, right? And they're like admonishing themselves on their own thoughts, let alone their actions. But that is a high spiritual station. But it's good for us to know that those stations exist, that there are people who literally are so careful and they're so in tune with their spirituality that the thoughts that they get, they're able to channel those thoughts to make sure they're good thoughts. That bad thoughts don't even enter their heart. And if they do, they immediately seek forgiveness of Allah because they don't want to be held accountable, even though you're not held accountable for your thoughts. But they're trying to be very, very, very careful, not just in their actions. This requires a very conscious approach to our deen and to our spirituality. So he says, then you have to remind your soul of 3 things. First is, you have to know that God is watching you at every step and remind it of that. Right? So 1 time a day, just talk, again, it sounds weird, just talk to yourself and tell yourself, Allah is watching me today. So I better behave. You gotta tell yourself that, right? And slowly you do that every day. Ultimately, the nafs, like I mentioned, is like an animal. It needs to be trained, and it will start to submit. But the second step after you do that, if it doesn't work, you have to remind yourself that you have 2 angels here. 1 here, 1 here. So like in total, in addition to, inshallah, any of the other angels that are in the masjid, there's a bunch of angels in this room. I can't count everybody, but 2 for every person that are literally, there are 2 angels that are with you. And you have to remind yourself of that. That like, hold on, how could I be doing this? The angel is seeing everything I'm seeing right now on my phone. Uh-oh. And he's writing everything down. And we know, right, that the right angel is writing the good and that the left angel is writing what is bad. And not like God doesn't know, but this is going to be the kitab that you get, the book of deeds that you get on the day of judgment. So the angel will be able to pinpoint to you on September 22nd, at this point in time, you were in such and such a place doing such and such, and it'll all be written in your book. So he says, if you can't know that God is watching you, at least remind yourself that the angels are watching you and that they're aware of what you're doing as a method of sitting with it. I'm just going to finish this section, inshallah. I'll get to the question. I will get to the question. I need to finish the section now. Then the third thing he says is, if you can't remember that the angels are watching you and it doesn't work, realize that you will die at some point. and let death suffice as a reminder. That sit with the fact that, okay, I'm going to die, and everything I do is going to impact me in some way, either positively or negatively when I die. And usually death is the thing that is not always, but it can really wake somebody up. That I know many people who have seen quite a few people die in front of them, and that was the means of their turning back to Allah. Maybe they grew up Muslim, they kind of stopped practicing, and then they saw a lot of death, and then they began to practice the religion again, because they realized, hold on, death doesn't only come when you're 75. It can also come when you're 7, or when you're 18, or when you're 23, or when you're 32, and so on and so forth. It can come at any moment. And so he mentions to realize and sit with that. Those are the 3 levels. This first is know that God is watching you. Then realize that the angels are watching you, if that doesn't wake us up. Then realize that death is very, very close. And then depending on the type of person that you are, you can use other tools. The 4th one he mentions is, if you're the type of person who really is incentivized by reward, remind yourself of how many rewards there are coming to us, inshallah, if we have a successful life in the next life, in heaven. And if you are the type of person who is more admonished by some fear instilled in you, reflect on how serious the hellfire is and how much punishment can happen. And when we say reflect here, all of these things, and there's a whole section we'll get to in a couple of weeks, inshallah, probably 2 weeks, inshallah, just on reflection and what that means. But you have to sit with this stuff. This is not just think about it for 2 minutes and then move on. This is you sit with just one concept for I would advise 10, 20, 30 minutes, and just sit in a room and contemplate the fact that you have angels that are with you and they're watching you and they're writing everything down. Because it has to become a spiritual muscle that's built. Nobody builds muscle when working out with 1 or 2 minutes in the gym. That requires significant amounts of exercise and concentrated exercises where you increase the weight gradually until the muscle mass starts to develop, right? If you just do the same thing over and over again, the muscle is not going to work, which is why in order to travel the spiritual path, the deeds have to increase in quality, most importantly, and also quantity, right? You do the fara'id, and then you do the sunnah, and then you do the nawafil, and so on and so forth. Sidi Fenton, you were going to say something.
Yeah, okay. When we were talking about remembering God, you've probably heard the thing that Marie said that God is with me, God before me, God is watching over me, or God is near me. If you repeat that, God is with me, God before me, God is watching over me. If you repeat that during every prayer, it helps bring that awareness. So that's an exercise that I've heard you.
Excellent idea. Mashallah, I was going to mention that at the end, right? So Sidi Fenton, he mentioned that one way to do this is to remind yourself, sit with it, either at the beginning, right before you engage in salah, right before you sit down to do anything, to do dhikr, especially something in relation to your spirituality, but that you remind yourself, practically, Allah is with me. Allah is watching me. Allah sees me. Allah hears me. Allah is aware of my thoughts. So there's a couple of very specific, you could just use these specific phrases, right? That God is with me. Allah is watching me. And you can just remind yourself. So it just repeats over and over again until the intellect understands and then the heart understands. So that would be very, thank you. That would be something that we can very much try to do as ideally once a week, if not, more often. So then he says, what are the results of this? How are you going to know this is working? He says, you will feel in yourself a shyness that prevents you from disobeying him and makes you start to exert yourself in the path of deen. There will be a shyness that develops inside that I can't disobey God. How could I let him down? How? He's the one who created me. He's the one who's given me so much. He's the one who wants so much good for me. He has so much love for me. How can I disobey him? Ideally, that is your ideal type of shyness and the awareness you want. You don't want to have the approach too much on the side of God is going to punish me, and your entire view of Allah is punishment. It might work for some people, but generally speaking, you want to have a balance between hope and fear. And you want to have this idea though, okay, I have to be careful what I do, not because of anybody in society. When this mindfulness becomes a reality, the next thing that starts to happen is you stop caring about the opinions of people over the opinion of God. the opinion of Allah is the most important. It reigns dominant. So like, what is Allah going to think? Not what is this person going to say? What is that person going to say? It doesn't mean we don't care about our reputation communally. Alhamdulillah, that should be something that's important too. But you're not doing things for the sake of people. Whether somebody says, what is this person going to say if I show up here, well, what is Allah going to say? What is Allah going to think, right? I remember somebody was telling me that they made a specific choice of something to wear, and then they went to this place, and at that place, and they weren't, they know that what they were wearing was probably not the best thing. At the place that they went to, turns out is like the mufti of the masjid or something like that, or the scholar. And now they're like trying to make sure that this person doesn't see them. And on the way home, it hit them. Hold on a second. God was watching me the whole time. Why does it matter what this person was going to say? God was watching me the whole time. I shouldn't have made that choice in the first place. Who do I care more about? Which opinion do I care more about? That it takes time. Sometimes your teachers and parents will serve as the means to help you realize that, but that's not the end goal. The fear our parents instill when we're young in us, make sure I don't see you doing this, I don't see you doing that, I don't see you doing anything haram. It's not so that when they're gone, we can go and do all the haram. It's so that when they're gone, and when they're not with us, we still remember that God is with us. And that transition sometimes is not always done appropriately. Like on that specific topic, it's really, really important if we do have kids or if we have siblings or younger siblings, cousins, that we make sure that the fear is for Allah and the love is for Allah, and it's not that the fear is for the parents. Because once the parents they pass away, God forbid, or that they are just not with us, it's very difficult to inculcate that. Yes, there's a question. Yeah.
The word Taqwa, right? And the reason I'm bringing it up is to actually know what the word in Arabic is. But what I remember is that it's actually a fence around you or a guard around you. But it's not to be looked at as you scared that Allah is going to destroy you or punish you, but the way between a relationship between a husband and wife. This is our marriage. Do not go outside the marriage because you will separate us from each other.
Right.
And you're scared of the separation, but the consequence of that separation is punishment.
Right.
And I don't know what the word is. That's what I'm asking. Is that the root word for Taqwa? But
Right.
It's oneself. Like it's your marriage. You don't look at this woman over here because it's going to cause a problem in the household and division.
Right.
Or anything that you will make upset with your loved one.
Right. So the question was, and just repeating it for those that are online, about taqwa and how exactly does this concept of taqwa relate to what we're talking about, and is the root of the word taqwa related to this idea of kind of putting a fence around yourself and putting some guardrails so that you don't cross the bounds. So essentially, and taqwa it's a very, 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 like it's an ocean of knowledge just to understand taqwa, but it is about protecting yourself, right? And so what we're talking about here, the one who has taqwa is engaging in mindfulness. One way to translate taqwa would be God consciousness, would be a mindful fear of Allah, but it's to protect yourself such that, I'll give you one example, similar to what you mentioned. It's like in this pandemic, right? Especially when things were more strict. The level of precaution that those who fear getting sick were taking around. I have to do this, I have to wear wear a mask, I have to social distance, I have to be hyper careful to not go in a situation where there's a lot of people. And you know what the rules are, and you tread very carefully to follow those rules, because if not, you could get sick. Regardless of someone's views on the pandemic and so on and so forth. Ultimately, we know it's a test from Allah and it is a sickness, and the Prophet ﷺ himself gave us advice on what to do when a plague comes down. That would be an example. If you applied that spiritually to haram and to what you're supposed to be doing, that would be a way to instill taqwa. That I need to make sure the spiritual mask of protection is always on me. So there's always one layer, or ideally multiple, between me and the sin, right? And so that is the concept of taqwa, is treading very, very carefully. One of the scholars described it. They said it's like you're walking through a field that has, like these flowers that have thorns on them. It's like you're walking through that and you're trying to make sure that you don't rip your pants or you hurt your legs as you're doing it. So you're being very careful how you tread. That would be somebody who's very mindful of Allah and who has taqwa, is very careful how they go about their life, because they want to make sure they don't displease God. Yeah. And so just to kind of finish up this specific topic on the trait of whether we're with raising kids or with regards to younger siblings, it's very, very important to make sure that the dominant emotion associated with Allah is one of positivity, one of love, and one of the knowing that He is watching you and that He is with you and that He loves you, and you don't want to disappoint somebody you love. If you love Him and He loves you, how would you disappoint them, right? And then it has to be balanced with fear, but it should be disassociated from parents. I see too often that people are very, very careful on what they do around their parents, and then as soon as they go to college, everything changes because parents aren't there. That means that something was wrong in the approach. Something was wrong in the approach because the taqwa should have been instilled for Allah, not fearing parents, right? And then at some point, if your parents find out, then you start to change. That's not the goal that we want to get to. And it's okay, it's not easy to do this, but I'm just saying that should be where we direct our approach. And so then he mentions that you have to admonish yourself and sit with yourself practically, or sit with yourself and have specific moments where you practically instill this, as we just mentioned. So like the few takeaways from this that I would advise is have time every week where you just sit in a room, close the lights, and just imagine that you're in your grave. Imagine death. The Prophet ﷺ would regularly reflect on death, and he told us to reflect on death in some hadith multiple times a day. The believer should be reflecting on death. In our times, when there's so much hustle and bustle, even when we get a moment to ourselves, we're not with ourselves, we're with our phone. We're not ever really just with ourselves. We have to have those moments where we just sit and think and ponder the deeper things that are going to happen. What that's going to do, it will start to forcibly instill this shyness and this mindfulness of Allah. And then you will immediately notice the effect and the potency or of what you just did. When you go out to do something wrong, you'll be like, wait, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. Because you'll have trained yourself to realize that God is with me and that I'm going to die, right? So those three concepts of Allah is watching me, Allah is with me, Allah sees me. And then if that doesn't do the job, the angels are writing everything down and they're aware. And then you pair that with death. If somebody does that in reflection on death, these are spiritual medicines that the Prophet ﷺ gave us that cure the sicknesses that we all have. As Allah mentions in the Quran regularly, fi qulubihim maradan, that the heart is sick. You have sickness in the heart, and the heart needs to be cured. And we'll talk about that, inshallah, more next time. Yes?
About the death, I was just going to say, remembering death, it also makes you not have such long hopes.
Right.
Say, oh, I can be good later, I can be good later. It makes you want to shape up now. If you have things to do it now and not have long hopes, which is a very important principle.
Yeah. And so it's mentioned that remembering death will allow us to actually not just have so many hopes, especially when it comes to like, I'll get to this later, right? Hopes from I hope that good things will happen, inshallah, it's fine. But long hopes in this instance would mean that, I'll get to this later. I have plenty of life to live. I'll do good later in life, right? That is not the way of the Muslim. The Muslim is one who maybe we don't always think that we will die every day. The Prophet ﷺ would actually, one time the Sahaba were with him on a journey. It's narrated in the Ihya of Imam al-Ghazali, that in the book on death, that when the Sahaba were with him and he stopped at a point and he went to relieve himself, and then he made tayammum. And they said, why are you making tayammum, Ya Rasulullah? We'll eventually get to water and it's not time to pray. He said, look at so-and-so who thinks that he'll live to the point where we'll get to water. What if we don't get there? Right? This was the utmost level of you got to think that I might not be here. And it has to be balanced, not so that you're not completely freaking out all the time, right? Like someone invites you to hang out. I can't hang out with you. I'm going to die. It has to be balanced. But generally speaking, you definitely don't hang out in a place that's someone invites you to do something haram. That you would be like, that's not what I want to do. But we have to make sure we have moments in our life, because we've gone to the other extreme where we don't remember death at all. We never see death. Even in the society we live in, they have strategically positioned and mapped out the way cities are structured, such that graveyards in Muslim societies, if anybody ever goes to, let's say, Turkey, you'll be in Istanbul, and then all of a sudden it's a giant graveyard in the middle of the market or something. And then you'll be walking somewhere, there's another big, it just reminds you. And those graveyards might be 500, 600, 700 years old, right? So they're not obviously going to have moved them. But in Western societies, they don't even want to call it a graveyard. They call it a memorial park, so that you try to completely disassociate any recollection of death, and then they put it in the most random, obscure parts of the society, so it never comes to you. So everything that you remember is dunya, capitalism, consumerism, consumption, so on and so forth. Because if you remember death, you might stop consuming. We might stop consuming things. Hold on a second. What do I need all this stuff for in the first place? But that goes against the framework they have in the society. They don't want to do that. They want you to consume, and otherwise their whole system breaks down. So it's very much like the way we live is not the way that the people of the past used to live. So you have to do things in your time very specifically, methodically, that maybe the people of the past didn't need to do because they just lived this every single day. So I'll just mention, does anybody have any questions about this? I just want to get through like one short section and then we'll finish, inshallah. Does anybody have questions though on this concept? Or on what we talked about last time, intentions? Questions on mindfulness? Hopefully it makes sense. Okay, alhamdulillah. And so then the last piece that would be advised is when you actually get to talking to yourself, right? You actually like start to hold yourself to account. And there's whole books written on how to take yourself to account. It's called the eventual state of muhasabah, where you actually start to know that I got to take myself. You take yourself to account before Allah takes you to account, as the saying goes. And so you sometimes actually have to say to yourself, and again, very, very practically, why did you do this? Right? Don't you know this isn't okay? And you admonish yourself, and you, again, your husband or your wife or someone might hear you, like, what the heck are you doing in that room over there? Like, who are you talking to? No one else here. Just, I'm talking to my nafs. You got to make it and I mean this in a not comedic way. Have to make it enough. If someone is treading the path of spirituality, they have to make this stuff not be so weird, and they have to actually realize that these are the things that are going to benefit us in life. That I actually take myself to account at least once a day before I go to bed. I recall. And then I take myself to account. Why did you do that? Why did I miss that prayer? Why did I pray so late? Dhuhr was in at 1:30. Why did I pray at 4:58 right before Asr came in? What was that? Why did I do that? Right? You take yourself to account and you remind yourself. Next time, don't do. And then what the Sahaba would do is they would put rewards and punishments next to it, right? So if you did something wrong, I have to give away $10,000 in donate. That would be like an intense example, but I got to give away $50 every time I say a curse word. Your nafs won't want to say curse words anymore because eventually your bank account will go dry, right? And you'll have to hold yourself to account. I have to give $100. You start upping the bounty and the intensity when you start to get closer and closer to doing it. So it's like every time I miss Fajr is $500 I got to give away. You won't miss Fajr anymore. Unlikely, right? Because it's so much that you have to, and you hold yourself to account for that, right? Or every time I have, and that's what I mean giveaway like in charity or something, right? Every time I look at something impermissible and I don't lower my gaze, I have to go and do the thing I hate doing the most. Like clean the dishes or clean the bathroom or something. Whatever that thing is you don't like doing, the chore you don't like doing, you put yourself, and you won't want to do that sin anymore. This is the level of taking yourself to account, right? Now this links then, it starts to foster this state of muraqabah and the state of vigilance inside of us. So that would be something, inshallah, that we aspire to do. So then the next section that he mentions, and is on the inner and outer self. And this is a very, very quick section. Inshallah, for those coming for Isha, we're praying at 9, if that's okay. But if you guys want to pray, please feel free to go ahead. He mentions the inner and outer self, and here he says that this is now an entirely new topic. So we moved on from the first one. Just to clarify, anybody have questions about the first one? Nothing, right? Okay. He then goes on to say that you have to improve your inward aspect until it becomes better than your outward appearance. Your inside has to be better than your outside. And he said the Prophet ﷺ would make a dua that, Ya Allah, make my inward better than my outward and make my outward virtuous. Not that we don't have outward. We should be people who also follow all the outward sunnahs. But he said, make my inward better than my outward. And so there is a shift you'll notice in the people of spirituality, that inward is the goal. You do not want to be somebody who prays fasts, gives zakat, gives charity, does all these outward acts, and you were just a jerk. Something's wrong. Spirituality has gone wrong. It didn't work. Or you just get angry all the time. Didn't work. Whatever we were doing didn't work because the inward was not purified. The inward has to be purified as we engage in this spiritual process. And so it comes in a hadith, I believe in the collection of Imam Muslim, or on the authority of Sayyidina Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, that the Prophet ﷺ said, verily Allah does not look at your appearance or your wealth, but rather he looks at your hearts and your actions. He is looking to see what kind of traits does this person have on the inside. And so the ultimate assessment for how we're doing should start with an inward assessment. Where am I at in the state of my heart? And start to reflect. And so what we just talked about, the first concept really links to this, because when you start to reflect that Allah is watching me, that's not to say like Allah is watching me to like see, am I looking fly today? And that's not what, no, it's Allah is watching me. Like, what's going on in here? What am I thinking today? What am I worried about today? What am I stressed about today? It will start to have an impact on all of these different areas. And so we know the very, very famous hadith that's mentioned often, where the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that in the body is a piece of flesh. And and I'm paraphrasing here, when it is good, the whole body is good. And when it is corrupt, the rest of the body is corrupt. And verily, it is the heart. And so the heart has to be purified in order for you to live a sound life. And we know that Allah mentions in the Quran that يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ إِلَّا مَنْ أَطَاعَ اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. Is that the verse? Right? That is on that day, neither wealth nor children, and this essentially meaning all the other things we care about, wealth, stocks, money, investments, houses, cars, status, followers, fame, none of it's going to matter. It will be irrelevant. Once you die, it's gone. None of it matters. إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَاعَ اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ, except the one who comes to Allah with a sound heart, with a purified heart. And so Imam al-Haddad is encouraging us that if you want to tread the path of spirituality, the goal has to be a pure heart. You have to get that right. And you have to always assess yourself. How am I doing with purity? How am I doing? The two easiest ways to measure that, practically speaking, that I would that are advised by Imam al-Ghazali, Imam al-Haddad, and the scholars, your desires and how much you get angry. Those would be like two very easy ways to assess how we're doing. Desires, this goes to the desire for the sexual appetite, the desire for food, the desire for money, the desire for fame. There's a whole bunch of desires that the human being has, but the 4 or 5 that I just mentioned are some of the chief ones. How are we doing? Are we desiring God more, or are we desiring these other things more? And then the anger is really, really important in this instance, because the one who cannot control his anger will have a very, very difficult time actually being able to become pure. It's not that the Muslim doesn't get angry, but we don't lose our cool. We have to know, okay, how am I doing with regards to this? And so he says practically 3 things. Beware of if you are doing in secret. If what you are doing in secret were to become exposed to the people, would you be ashamed? Because it means that you're not emphasizing the inward enough. If you think you're doing something in secret and all of your friends and the people in your circles and at the masjid and so on and so forth were to find out, and you would be like, yeah, I'm pretty ashamed about that. That means that something's wrong, because if you were focusing on the inward, you would not really have much to be ashamed about, right? And if you were, we were all works in progress, but that is the person who is focused. Maybe you look the part outwardly, but then on the inside, a lot of stuff's going wrong. One of the chief problems in the Muslim world today, a lot of outward emphasis on Islam, very little inward emphasis. And so you generally have a type of harsh strictness that's forming without the loving mercy and the actual implementation of some of the most critical aspects of the deen. And then he mentions, don't do anything in secret that you wouldn't do in public. So hold yourself, at minimum, hold yourself to that equal standard. I'm not going to do anything in secret that I wouldn't do in public. That starts to inculcate, again, this trait of vigilance, and then it also starts to make the inward more of an emphasis. And so and then finally, see how much you care really, and again, this is the reason I merged these two together because they're very much linked, how much you care about what people think about you versus what God thinks about you. And just put that on a scale and just be honest with yourself. How badly do I care what everybody on Facebook and Instagram and so on and so forth thinks about me? Like, how much do I care? And then how much I'm posing and trying to show the best side of myself. And then where's my inner work to polish every aspect of myself to show God that I'm good, right? Because he doesn't look at the forms. One of my teachers mentioned that one time he was like, got like a scratch on his car, and he was like, I got a scratch on my car. And his mom was like, if only you cared this much every time you got a scratch on your heart, you'd be such a better person. She didn't say the last part. But if every time you got a scratch on something, instead of if only you cared, we got a scratch on our floors or some new thing that we have, or we drop our phone, if only we cared every time those scratches were coming on the heart, what kind of people then could we aspire to be? And so that's an important trait, or an important trait to inculcate inside, inshallah. And so the last thing that we'll kind of end with is just avoiding being with people who are not emphasizing the inward. You want to, generally speaking, try to make sure that you spend time and company and you learn from people who have an inward component to their religiosity and to their religious practice. Because if every single thing is about the outward, something is off there. You have to make sure, and the second thing is to understand how their character and your character are improving as you spend time with them. The more you spend time with people of knowledge, the more your character should improve, because you'll be observing their character. But if they don't have good character, they weren't people of knowledge to begin with, because knowledge is something that actually translates into action. It's not just facts and figures that we memorize. And so one of the other ways that the scholars mentioned to help emphasize the inward, to help gain this practical realization that Allah is always watching me, and to become somebody who treads this path of purity, is you spend time with good people. Spend time, right? Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu ittaqullaha wa kunu ma'a. Anybody know the rest of the verse? Kunu ma'a sadiqeen. That those who believe have taqwa of Allah and be with the sadiqeen, the people who have attained the highest stations of sidq, right? Be with good people, basically. That's one of the ways to help us attain the state of taqwa. And so if we're always hanging out with people who are kind of pulling us away from the deen, then we start to slowly improve this. Okay, I'm going to spend if I hang out with people 3 times a week, and all 3 are from people who are kind of pulling me away, one of those hangouts I'm going to make with somebody who pulls me towards the deen. And then maybe the other 2, I'll get to it. And then eventually 2 of those hangouts I'm going to make with people who pull me closer to Allah. And then finally, I'm only going to hang out with people who are at least not taking me away and ideally pulling me closer, right? And you do so, again, in a balanced way where you don't make people feel like they're terrible people and you can never hang out with them and because you're so righteous and so on and so forth. That would mean something else is wrong with the inward, because now the trait of arrogance has appeared. And so it's a very, very careful path to tread. But the rest of the topics that we'll be talking about will all have this framework on emphasizing the inward as a means of then purifying yourself. And then, inshallah, those traits will manifest on the outward. So inshallah, we'll go ahead and end here. If anybody has questions, for those online, if you have questions, just put them in the chat. Anybody has questions, we'll do 5 minutes questions and then we'll end. And it can be related to this or anything we discussed, so far. Questions? Okay, I'm gonna see if any questions online. We'll just give about a minute for those online if they have questions. There's one here too. Okay, alhamdulillah. Any more questions? Sisters, anything? Yes, question? There's no such thing as a bad question. Bismillah.
This is kind of like one of the first classes.
Yeah.
But, basically, are more anxious. And I was curious that there are people that naturally have very anxious tendencies. So I'm curious if we talk about anxiousness, one, is it like usually how we talk about it in the Western perspective? And then two, if so, like how do you reconcile that with like people that you think are super strong in their faith, but are known to have like very anxious tendencies, and like how do you grapple with those two things?
Good question. So the question was, in the first class or the second class, we talked about anxiety and how those who have a strong yaqeen, a strong certainty in Allah, that they generally will have, they won't be people of anxiety. Right? Their anxiety will reduce. The proof of it, Allah mentions, "Inna awliya Allah la khawfun alayhim wa lahum yahzanun." That the awliya of Allah, that they neither fear nor grieve, or they don't have this kind of tense anxiety all the time. They're generally not people who are stressed out. So the question was, how do we kind of grapple with that? But people who are naturally disposed to something. It's an excellent question. So a couple of things. One, someone might have a specific test that is not always going to fit within like a parameter, right? Let's say you have a general rule, and then there might be somebody that their main test, they could be people of faith, but they just get depressed a lot. They could actually be getting tested with that. They could have significant amounts of hasad on them. Let's just say, Allah protect all of us, but that's a very, very real thing, where now anxiety starts to come because of these outward elements. So that might be like a isolated time where someone is being tested with something, and now God wants in those moments of anxiety for them to turn to Him always. Because the ultimate goal is not even that you're in a state of peace. The ultimate goal is you're always with God and turning to God in every single second. That's the goal. You always want to be turning to God. And sometimes the most difficult circumstances will drive the human being to God the most. But generally speaking, and this is at least the way that I've understood it, Allahu alam, that the more somebody has an inner yaqeen, and this is not always that someone is articulating and always talking about religion, or someone is showing that their faith is strong, but deep down inside, and only God will truly know this, they actually have really, really firm faith. They are people of firmness. They have when we make the dua, Ya muqallib al-qulub wal-absar, thabbit qalbi ala dinik, that, oh, the one who's turning hearts, make my heart firm in this deen. They are generally people who are not fazed by things. And so the one thing I would mention here is we might just not have seen people in our times or in our societies who are even at this station. It's a very high station. When we talk about yaqeen and these stations of yaqeen and attaining the station of haqq al-yaqeen, that these things that I mentioned in the Quran, these aren't just like things that are passed out like willy-nilly or easily. Generally speaking, you would have to meet an arrived spiritual master to know somebody who is completely in a state where anxiety never phases them or stress never phases them. The rest of us, we're going to face this stuff. We're going to have moments of stress and anxiety. Our goal, though, is what practical steps do we take from the Quran and from the Prophet's outline to calm us down? Ala bi dhikrillah tatma'innul qulub. That verily in the dhikr of Allah, the hearts find rest. So do we turn to dhikr of Allah? Do we turn to the dua where the Prophet gave us, Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-hammi wal-hazan wa a'udhu bika min al-ajri wal-kasal wa a'udhu bika min al-jubni wal-bukhl. There's a whole dua specifically for anxiety and stress and worry that somebody has and grief. And so that's the kind of measure, but it doesn't mean that there's not a higher station out there. You could be a person who you and I might think we have strong iman, but we're faced by anxiety. It means we've not kind of started to get where we want to get to, right? Because the ultimate stations of yaqeen, yes, the Prophet ﷺ, the proof for this, and we'll end with this inshallah, is that when Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq and the Prophet ﷺ were in the cave and they were hiding from the Quraysh were trying to assassinate them and they were chasing them. And they hid in a very, very small kind of area where the Quraysh were walking, and then we know that the spider spun the web such that it looked like that place had been there. Nobody could have entered that area. And Sayyidina Abu Bakr was in a state of worry. He was in a state of worry, even though, of course, he has strong iman. But he wasn't worried for himself. He was worried for the Prophet ﷺ. And of course, his iman is still not at the level of the Prophet ﷺ. But what then did Allah do? The Prophet ﷺ told Sayyidina Abu Bakr, and Allah mentions this in Surah Tawbah, I believe, right? That tell your companion, La tahzan, don't worry. Allah, inna Allaha ma'na. That say Allah is with us. And the Prophet ﷺ told Sayyidina Abu Bakr that he asked him, Ya Rasulullah, if they look down, they're going to see us. He said, oh Abu Bakr, what do you say to somebody that they are two and Allah is their third? Allah is the third that's with them. he was completely calm. Even though, of course, if your life is about to potentially go and you're being on the hunt for, you're getting assassinated, it rightfully makes sense to be in a state of worry. But the Prophet ﷺ, who has achieved the perfect state, he's the perfect human being who's achieved the perfect state of Iman, he wasn't worried. And Allah said, La tahsan inna Allaha ma'na. And then the verse after that Allah sends a sakina, Allah sends a tranquility, right? And then the tranquility calms them down. So there were many times where the Sahaba in battle, as they're facing the Quraysh, it's not easy. They have anxiety, but they're turning to Allah. And as they're going through their process, Allah is sending tranquility and ease. And then that anxiety ends up being a means for them to get closer to God. But there's always work to do to then achieve the more higher states of yaqeen. That never really stops. What we're mentioning here is just the kind of like easy bullets that he's laid out, so we understand, what the higher stations are that we can go to. And so, inshallah, we'll go ahead and end. Let me just make sure nothing. Yes.
Could you give us that dua about anxiety, and could you give that to us in English, please?
Yeah. I'm gonna actually pull together in like a document. Can I give that to you, or do you want me to just relate it right now?
Please, you relate it to everyone.
Yeah. The dua is Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-hamli wal-hazan wa a'udhu bika min al-ajli wal-kasal wa a'udhu bika min al-jubni wal-bughl wa a'udhu bika min ghalabat ad-dayni wa qahri rijal. It's a dua that we should read every morning and every evening.
Can you translate that, please?
Yeah, I need to
Just do your best off the cuff.
Yeah, Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-hamli wal-hazan, that, oh Allah, I seek refuge in you from grief and anxiety and from miserliness and from being overpowered by debts and from, I think, something along the lines of from being kind of overpowered by other people. Yeah, that would be the translation. It's a very, very famous dua. Yeah. If you just Google Hamli wal Hazan dua, it'll come up, inshallah. But don't take your deen generally from Google. Okay. Alhamdulillah. So inshallah, we'll go ahead and end. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. La ilaha illa anta subhanak inni kuntu minadh dhalimin. Rabbana atina fid dunya hasanatan wa fil akhirati hasanatan wa qina adhaban nar. Rabbana taqabbal minna innaka antas samiul alim wa tub alayna innaka antat tawwabur rahim. Ya Allah, Ya Rahman, we ask that you forgive us and that you pardon us and that you increase us in yaqeen and that you increase us in certainty and you increase us in tranquility and that you remove our anxieties and remove our troubles and you remove our worries and inculcate us in a state, Ya Allah, that we remember you in all of our moments and that we realize that you are with us and we realize that you're watching us, Ya Allah. Make us people of taqwa and make us people of ma'rifah and make us people who are trying to aspire to get closer to you, and pardon us for our slips and our misgivings and our bad thoughts and everything that we do that you are displeased with. We ask you for everything good that the Prophet ﷺ asked for, and we ask you for protection from everything evil that he asked protection from. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah.